ahead and get started. We'll have two more presentations, and then we're all done for the day. Kostas from Drexel, he'll be presenting on trade and insecurity, and you can see the title there. And we'll go 50 minutes from now, and then we'll do the usual 10 minutes of discussion.
Thanks, Mike. I too want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful conference. As you can see, there are two co-authors, you know, and they're patiently or maybe impatiently waiting for your questions. But I want to emphasize this as I go through the presentation. Please feel free to stop me at any moment and raise your questions. And we'll see how it goes. So as you can see from the title of the paper, it is about international trade and security. The title emphasizes a couple of things, but it's more than those things themselves. If you just observe the real world, one of the things that is, of course, clear to all of us is that all or almost all sovereign states arm, and they do that to defend their real or hypothetical interests. And of course, there are many reasons that they may do that. They may have to do with contracting and enforcement problems, asymmetric information, and so on. But if you think about international trade itself essentially takes place in an environment that we can characterize as anarchic. There is no supranational authority to enforce contracts. Of course, there has been something to that effect with the WTO, but ultimately it's national interests that are supposed to prevail in whatever sort of agreements might be signed in the context of trade or otherwise. And within that sort of environment, embargoes, different types of security policies, and different types of trade regimes are related, but how they are related is not as clear as it should be. If you look at international trade theory, it, for reasons that I cannot figure out yet, does not explore these issues. But international relations scholars have spent some time thinking about these issues, and there are in fact different schools of thought that emphasize the possible linkage that might exist between trade openness and conflict. One school, the classical liberal school, emphasized that trade openness alleviates conflict and promotes peace. And they usually cite certain reasons for that. One is if you have conflict, presumably you have to forego the gains from international trade, so that imposes discipline, presumably on policymakers. Or it is argued that trade itself may create constituencies that will favor peace, and it may do that by increasing contact certainly throughout the world, but also making commitments in terms of investments in relationships or what have you. And there's the other side, the realist, neo-realist school, which emphasizes that trade relations between states are essentially adversarial. One of the things that they emphasize is that trade itself may fuel frictions, because once nations benefit from doing so, from engaging in international trade, they may divert some of the benefits of that trade into building up their armies, and perhaps that may fuel conflict. And other international relations scholars emphasize the idea of security externalities that may be present when nations that are adversaries trade with each other. Typically those security externalities are adverse in that kind of environment, but of course you may have positive security externalities in their context if you have trade between allies. So whether one has free trade or not, they typically argue, depends on the nature of the security externalities. But there are problems or difficulties if you think about what is out there in the literature, and of course that leaves room for us to say something. Some of the problems are empirical. I mean, it's very difficult to make a strong case one way or another about whether trade promotes peace or not. You look at the First World War. Before that, trade openness was quite extensive, and the view was that there will be no world war, because if it did take place, then all countries would be hurt. Nonetheless, World War I did take place. If you look at the European Union, one of the reasons why it was formed, it had to do because there was this feeling that it will prevent conflict. So the evidence is not clear in terms of what the relationship between the two may be. One of the things that is clear, though, is that it's more than just talking about trade and conflict. One has to talk about institutions to manage conflict, and that seems to be something that the European Union has done reasonably well. But if you look at the formal modeling of this kind of linkage that might exist between trade and conflict, most of the models are not really formal trade/conflict theoretic models, and they don't really emphasize the possible linkages that might be there between world prices, factor prices, and how then these factor prices may condition the composition of output within societies and incentives to build arms. So one needs full-blown general equilibrium models to understand that, and one, of course, would like to have some sort of strategic interactions between nations that may perhaps engage in some sort of conflict.
Sorry.
Yes?
The liberal theory is fully consistent with a purely bilateral model, because you're talking about the gains from trade,
yeah,
that the two countries that would be otherwise involved in conflict are enjoying if they don't go to war. Whereas it seems to me that the neo-realist theory, that kind of negative impact that openness may have on peace only makes sense if you are thinking about trade openness internationally having an effect on like two potential competitors on the same side of the gains on trade that are competing and how they become adversaries. So in some sense, what makes it even more unclear, is more a comment than a question, is whether one looks at dyadic relationships or looks at the level of openness in the overall environment, what effects has on individual behavior.
Well,
whereas on the other direction, like peace toward, if you go like causality from conflict to trade, that's mostly like technological. I mean, if you're bilaterally, if you're not going to war, well, there's peace, so you can do other stuff. And the multilateral one is not even there. So I think there is a lot to understand even before looking at data about this stuff.
Well, that's a great point, a collection of points. Certainly, if you look at a two-country world, then you would expect the liberal view to hold true, because if they do, I mean, for obvious reasons. But if you talk more generally about dyadic relationships, that's not necessarily the case, and there's more work, of course, to be done that way, because there are linkages between other economies and how then spillovers of conflict or of trade itself on conflict may occur when you have just two countries engaging in conflict, say, are unclear. In fact, the model that I will talk about goes beyond the two-country setting. So it takes us in that direction. We do that partly for convenience, partly because it's a starting point in this kind of line of research, and partly because we want to abstract from some things, such as price effects in the context of trade, that we know play an important role. But you'll see exactly what I mean as we go on with this, but it's a great point. Okay, and if you look at some of these models, sometimes there is no arming even. And of course we know arming is quite important economically. In fact, many countries do spend a significant, a large portion of their GDP in building and maintaining armies. And often there are no clear-cut strategic linkages between trade and army. Certainly that's my understanding of some models in international relations that I've seen. And often, of course, there is no clear-cut distinction about what kind of conflict one is talking about. That may be important. it is a motivation for us to focus on one particular type of conflict that we understand reasonably well. So this paper essentially will focus on conflict between two countries, but that is going to be in a three-country kind of environment. More on this shortly. And conflict is going to take a particular form. It's going to be over a disputed resource. You can think of that resource as being a piece of land that perhaps contains oil or precious metals or gas, water, and or it may be an island. These are all these are things that one can talk about in the context of our model. So we will talk about that in a model that has been very much the workhorse in international trade theory, the Heckscher-Ohlin model. We will consider an augmented version of that. You will see some of the details shortly. But roughly at this point, we want to use that kind of model because it makes it possible to pay attention to how resources that might be used to build up guns, arms, may affect the sectoral output in different industries in the economy, and that itself has implications for prices as well as welfare and so on. Okay, so some things to anticipate in an environment of this type. Certainly one wants to make sure one understands what opening an economy to international trade, free trade in particular, may mean, whether international trade will lead to gains from trade in the presence of conflict. This is something that we have something to say about. Another issue, of course, that is very much studied by international trade economists has to do with the structure of comparative advantage. There are well-developed models. The Heckscher-Ohlin model itself establishes a linkage between relative endowments technology, or relative endowment differences between economies, technology, and trade patterns, which goods countries export and which ones they import. We want to see whether the conventional wisdom on the standard trade models hold in a model where there is this potential for conflict, or there is conflict. I do want to emphasize at the outset there are many things that one can do in the context of this model, and we are just essentially scratching the surface. There are all kinds of things that perhaps we can talk about. And of course, these are other things that I mentioned a little bit earlier. All of them are relevant for conflict, different types of resources that might be contested. Okay. Before I go on, what am I going to do? Let me just spell out some of the results, because this is a rather long paper, and actually I'm going to be selective in terms of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to mention some of the results that we have. Then I'm going to present the model, and then I'm going to try to convince you that some of the results that emerge make sense. And of course, I want to compare some of the results to what we typically see in the context of traditional trade theory, so that we have some contrast in the conclusions that we may arrive at. Okay. So the first thing that I have up there has to do with the distribution of power. This is not something that typically international trade economists or economists in general talk about, but it is something that we should. This is something that is endogenously determined. It is determined as a function of course, you would think, an economy's ability to produce its income, its endowments of resources. And because that, to some extent, determines how many arms they will be able to produce, and therefore that plays a role in who will prevail in the event of conflict. So we want to focus on that aspect, but we want to spell out some of the results that come out of the analysis, and one of them is that it's not always the case that larger economies are the ones that have the upper hand in conflict. They are not necessarily the most powerful ones. Okay? And in fact, there exist circumstances under which international trade may level the playing field in arms competition. In fact, it may lead to complete equalization of arms. We consider this as a benchmark case. Of course, in the real world, this is unrealistic. And actually, as you will see, that result depends on something having to do with factor prices. And those of you who are familiar with trade theory, you will recognize that the fundamental reason for that kind of result to emerge is that factor prices are equalized through international trade. But of course, there are many restrictions that have to hold for that to be true. In any event, the paper says something about the distribution of power and how that can be related to the distribution of endowments, secure endowments across nations. The paper says something about welfare. And one of the things that it says is that welfare is not necessarily the direction that we typically think of. The introduction of international free trade may be Pareto dominated, for instance, by autarky. And there may exist circumstances where one country may prefer international trade and the other one may prefer autarky.
But you say Pareto dominate. So
the first one, Pareto dominate from the point of view of all interacting partners.
It's not just one wants trade, the other wants autarky, all want.
The first one is yes, Pareto dominance.
Okay.
That's right. The other one is one may want to trade, the other one may not. Okay? As I alluded a little bit earlier, the paper will have something to say about trade patterns. And one thing that is clear is trade patterns are not, in the presence of conflict, are not necessarily going to be identical to the ones you would observe if there was no conflict. That may seem a little bit obvious. But perhaps one that is not as obvious is this, that if you look at what standard trade theory does, it really focuses on autarky prices, the prices one would observe if there is no international trade, market clearing prices, and compares those to world prices that one might see in a world market, or perhaps prices that might prevail if you engage in trade with another partner. And depending on how then prices in the world market compare to autarky prices, you can come up with predictions about what will be the direction of trade flows. Well, that's not necessarily the case in this environment. If you look at autarky prices, and then compare those autarky prices to world prices, that will not necessarily lead you to make the correct inference about trade patterns. That essentially arises in settings where there is enough asymmetry between agents, countries I should say. Okay? There's another issue that the paper really talks about, which has to do with the resource curse. In our context, essentially, that is a comparative static result, which states that if a country experiences an improvement in its terms of trade, an increase in the relative price of its exportable in the world marketplace, unlike what you typically see in standard settings, that may lead the country to be worse off. So if you can get a better price for the good that you export, that is not necessarily good news in an environment where there is conflict. Okay? Model. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the model is a variant of the Hexagon setting, but we depart from it in a number of ways. For one thing, we introduce its security over one resource. We can think of that resource as being labeled land. Okay? But within its economy, there is a security sector, a military sector if you want. There will be a production of guns. Okay? And it's going to be a three-country model. Two of the countries will be small in the world marketplace in the sense that they will be unable to influence world prices. The third one we want to think of as being the rest of the world, which is large. Think of this as a benchmark case. One wants to move in the direction of seeing what might happen if you allow for terms of trade effects of gun choices, of security policies. All right.
So the actual benchmark case would be one with two players, and then see what happens when you add a third player. Do you do that?
No, actually there is a reason for that, and the reason for it is partly convenience. If you do that, you have to really focus on, you have to allow prices of traded goods to be endogenously determined, which complicates the analysis considerably. They will have some sort of market power, right? And that calls for action in terms of trade policy itself. But in the context of our setting, countries are going to be small, so at least in the traditional setting, there will be no reason for them to wish to intervene in international trade. Okay, but here, they may have to, any interest in doing that. So partly it's because of that, because we want to avoid the terms of trade effects, which are kind of nagging and of interest, of course. Okay?
But they don't change the essence.
But they don't change the essence of some of the results. They change the essence, they change some results. For instance, the factor price equalization arms equalization result we have may change.
The only reason I mentioned it is that usually when you think of benchmarks, you think of like, you know, symmetry, 2, 3 players, but
we can still talk about symmetry here, and in fact I will reside in this later when I talk about results.
okay.
But I think the key reason for this is because we want to avoid terms of trade effect. But certainly that's something that we have results on, and we can talk about it later as well. All right, let me give you some feeling about what the timing of decisions will be here. Initially, given resource endowments of economies, I'll be more specific on that shortly, countries 1 and 2, the ones that will engage in some sort of conflict, will simultaneously make irreversible investments in guns. They will divert certain resources into the production of guns. Okay? I do want to emphasize this. Actually, in our setting, there will be 2 traded goods, and those will be consumption goods. Guns will not be traded, and resources themselves will not be traded internationally. Now you might say, well, there's a huge market for guns out there. Don't you want to include that in the analysis? Well, it turns out that some of the results that we would obtain if we allow for tradability in guns emerge even if you do not allow that. In some sense, trade in goods can be a substitute for that. But that's certainly something to extend the analysis of. Okay, in any event, in stage 1, if you want, given resources, countries choose their investments, their production of guns. Then, this disputed resource, which we call land, or it's going to be a portion of land, is divided between the contesting parties, the adversaries, country 1 and 2. How are they going to be divided? Well, we'll see in more detail, but they will be divided according to how strong they are militarily, how many arms they have built in the previous stage. Okay? The thing to keep in mind is that this is going to be a very standard neoclassical setting, but endowments themselves will be endogenous. So after that stage, production and consumption decisions are made, conditional on the trade regime that is anticipated to prevail down the road. And that trade regime could be either autarky, no international trade, in which prices adjust to clear domestic markets, or free trade, in which countries 1 and 2 will observe fixed prices in the world market for the traded goods. Okay? Products and factors of production. There will be 2 consumption goods in the spirit of the Hexerlin model, labeled 1 and 2. Guns, which will be a non-traded good, as I already mentioned. Now let's think about resources themselves, which are used to produce these goods and guns. Land, we use K here, you can think of this as capital, you give it whatever name, and I may make a mistake and call it capital later on. But essentially there are K0 units of insecure land, land that is contested by countries 1 and 2. And there are Ki units of secure land that nobody contests, that country I possesses. And there are Li units of inalienable labor. Okay? We will rely on contest success functions to model conflict. That itself is relevant, but the analysis can be extended to allow for other possibilities, including bargaining.
So this K0 is like at the time of the Far West, so it's land that, on which you don't have yet property rights.
You can think about it that way, but essentially the way we define the contest success function, this, if there is no investment, no production of guns at all, we assume that each country obtains half of this contested land, which it can then use for productive purposes. But if there is some production of guns, then that contested land is divided, yes, depending on that definition of the contest success function, which is pretty standard.
Does it matter that could we look at the case where it's owned by somebody and actually have a fight to reshuffle the...
You can do that, but if you did that, then you kind of move away from where we wanted to be. That will introduce some sort of asymmetry. Okay? And at least for convenience, from a modeling perspective, we want to move away from that.
Right.
But that's certainly something that you can incorporate into the analysis. Okay, products, endowments, technology. Technology is purely neoclassical. Okay, it can be described by unit cost functions, and that's what we have up there. That pitchfork psi is the unit cost function for producing guns. Notice that it depends on factor prices, the wage rate and the rental rate, so it's pretty standard. And we also have the unit cost functions for goods 1 and 2. If you think about that, the partial derivative of psi with respect to W, that's the conditional demand for labor, and you can similarly define conditional demands for inputs in our setting.
Sorry to
Yes.
ask you so many questions, but is it really an issue of conflict? So suppose that this unassigned land or this contested land is really like the contested territory of innovation on a new market. So what they're really doing is when instead of investing in guns, it would be, you could relabel it and say this is like investment on new ideas to conquer this market that has not been developed yet. And so it could be like a simple, research and development game.
Well, there are formal theoretical similarities between the two, but
What's
here,
specific about conflict here?
what it is
Because
that
you don't have any
it creates
decision.
conflict. There's a negative
But you have no decision to go to war or not. So where is conflict?
If I produce more guns, I get a bigger share of this contested
Yeah,
resource.
but you don't have a decision whether you do it peacefully or war. So it's like costless war or
It's not costless war. It's a war that involves drainage of resources. It could be a cold war for that matter. I mean, it's not necessary that you have destruction. I mean, and if you think about what usually gets these guns are socially unproductive activities. Essentially, all they do is redistribute this contested resource between the two parties, and that's fundamental.
Okay. But that's the only cost you have.
That's correct, and that's a good point, though.
The
But
cost of acquiring
you
guns.
could.
It's the
That's
same
right.
thing when you do in research and innovation investments. You throw away some resources because some of your research is not fruitful, and there is the fact that there is some. But the payoff, of course, is that you can shift the border of your market as much as you can shift the border of your property in the case zero land. So it's exactly equivalent.
It's not exactly equivalent, and the reason here is that if you don't invest in guns at all, then you get a portion of this land, and you can use it for productive purposes. Whereas if you don't invest in innovation, you don't get anything. But
Well, yeah.
But there are similarities between the two. Okay, consumer preferences. They are identical and homothetic. By the way, technology is also identical across all countries. Again, this is not realistic, but
And it's actually,
I'm sorry. It's
Actually,
actually, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So preferences are identical, homothetic. We can capture them with that indirect utility function. Policymakers, essentially, you can think of them as being unitary actors. They will aim to maximize national welfare. And national welfare here is going to be, national income here is nothing other than the income that is generated by the resources that are usefully employed for the production of consumption goods. And we can identify that then as being income generated by the residual endowments of land and labor after arms have been already produced. So here they are. Notice how they depend on the resources that are added or diverted because of production of guns. For instance, this tells you that the endowment that country I has of land to produce goods, consumption goods, depends on the inalienable endowment, plus what it gets of the contested resource, minus, of course, that portion of the resource that is used for the production of guns. And you can do the similar thing for labor. The thing to keep in mind is that the residual factor endowments certainly depend on secure endowments. They also depend on the relative price of consumption goods. How do they depend on the price of consumption goods? We will see that is because they depend on factor prices. Remember this psi, that was a function of factor prices, which we will shortly link to product prices. Okay? And of course, they also depend residual factor endowments on the share of the disputed land, which is a measure of, if you want, the degree of insecurity that might be there, as well as guns. And because we have homothetic preferences, relative demand is independent of income. Okay, so this is a setting where there is going to be perfect competition everywhere. And for convenience, we can imagine that good 2 is going to be, I said capital intensive, but it's supposed to be land intensive. And we're going to focus on a setting where all goods are essentially produced. Because of that, comparative pricing requires that the cost of producing, the marginal cost and average cost of producing good 1 is equal to its price, which here we normalize to unity. The price of good 2 is equal to, the unit cost of good 2 is equal to the relative price, essentially, of that good. And because both goods are produced and these relationships hold 2, then we can invert the system, and we know factor prices will then be a function of product prices. And of course, the traditional result that we know from trade theory is the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which says if you have an increase in the relative price of good 2, then you should expect to see a fall in the relative price of the good that does not employ the land-intensive good intensively, but that's labor. So the wage-rental ratio is going to fall. This kind of result is useful later on in the analysis. The other thing that we've got to keep in mind is that there will be factor market clearing within each country. So essentially what that says is the land that is employed in the production of good 1 as well as the production of good 2 must adapt to the residual endowment of land. And similar things ought to happen there for labor. And of course, these x's, which are outputs, we can think of as being functions, essentially, of the residual endowments. And then we have another result from traditional trade theory, which turns out to be useful analytically in what we do, and it's the so-called Rybczynski theorem. Now, if there is a change in the land-labor ratio of the economy, and that may be due to changes in arms, for instance, or in prices of traded goods, that itself will have an impact on the relative output of good 2. And in particular, what happens is, if there is an increase in the land-labor ratio, you observe a disproportionate increase in the output of the good that employs land intensively. That's good 2. Okay? All right, so this is roughly the setting, and let's move on to talk a little bit about welfare. All right, so welfare you can write down as a function of price and GDP, or income, which, as we suggested a little bit earlier, in its definition, is a function of prices and guns that countries may produce. It's from the usual properties of indirect utility functions, you can derive the excess demand function for good 2, which is essentially this is just Roy's identity, and this R function is a maximized GDP function, which has well-behaved properties. Okay, so actually that can be shown to be just equal to the supply function of this good. So that's one of the things that we ought to keep in mind, which come out of these properties of indirect utility functions. But the thing that may help sharpen the intuition on results is to focus on relative demand versus relative supply, which is kind of what I have on this axis, on the board, which tells you exactly what you might expect if there is an autarkic equilibrium, essentially given guns, or if you want, in a standard setting where there are no guns at all. This gives you the intersection of the two. Notice I have relative supplies and relative demands, okay? But I could have just focused on just one good, because by the Walras law, there's no need to do in both. But essentially, a setting like this one makes it possible for you, by focusing on relative demands and relative supplies, to say something about equilibrium prices and how price under autarky, and how these prices perhaps may differ when you allow for international trade. Okay, we talked about timing, might as well leave it aside now, and let's just look at the different components in welfare that we might observe if we differentiated the welfare function that I had a little bit earlier for country 1. Okay? This is going to help sharpen the intuition in terms of what will be the security policies, the optimal security policies that these countries 1 and 2 will pursue, and it will help us identify the relevant equilibria, non-cooperative equilibria, under autarky and under free trade. All right, so if we differentiated that utility function, that would depend on 3 components: price of traded goods, guns of country 1, and guns of the other country. Okay, so the first component is one that you typically see in the context of standard trade theory. It's just a terms of trade effect. If country 1, country I, imports good, the non-numeraire good, good 2, that MI is going to be positive. But if the price of that good, in relative terms, goes up, then that says that welfare is going to go down. And the reason for that is you're going to pay more for a good that you import from the rest of the world. That's standard. Now, what if country I changes its guns? If it increases its guns a little bit, there will be, abstracting again from other possible effects, especially price effects, there will be an impact on income. The first component over there is just the effect of increasing income through the fact that country I will get a little bit more of this contested resource. It will use it productively down the road, and because of that, income is going to be higher. But of course, there's a cost to doing that. The cost of doing that is some resources have to be diverted into the production of guns. And this pitchfork over R is nothing other than the unit cost of producing guns measured in units of land. Okay?
15 minutes.
Yes, thank you. And the last component over there tells you exactly what will happen to welfare of country I if its rival increased its guns. There you see a negative security externality. If they produce more guns, that would leave a lower share for us of the contested resource, and therefore our income is going to be lower. Okay? Okay, so we're ready to talk about trade regimes. Autarky. How can we think of autarky? Well, what we are going to have to be in search of, what we have to find is the quantities of guns that countries 1 and 2 will produce, non-cooperatively, and the prices that we will observe in countries 1 and 2 that will ensure market clearing domestically. So we have to be in search of 4 variables, actually. Okay? How do we do that? Well, the first thing to do is think about the first order condition of the country that maximizes national welfare. Okay? Let's go back. If country I changes its guns, why is it that only this component is relevant for welfare maximization? The answer is because under autarky, this MI is 0. There is no international trade. So there's no need to worry about price effects there. So the first order condition under autarky for country I is just that. If you want the marginal benefit of producing guns against the opportunity cost of doing that measured in units of land. But then, of course, we have to do the other thing. We have to pay attention to domestic product market clearing. And that's really what's shown down there. Either look at that, relative demand equal relative supply, or, of course, that. Okay. So 4 equations to define full-blown equilibrium under autarky. Let's just jump to free trade to see how things may be different there. By virtue of the fact that countries are small in international trade, the world price, the price that they face in the world market are just given down here. Okay? But look at the first order conditions. It looks like it's the same as before. Why is that? It's obvious if you look at this relationship. This price now is determined in the world market. If I change my guns, that will not affect the world price. Therefore, it looks like the first order condition is the same in autarky as and free trade. Well, that can be a little bit deceptive in terms of what sort of equilibria that gives rise to. There's a lot of complexity that comes out of that. Okay, so one of the things that we do is fully characterize this equilibria, establish existence, uniqueness, and all the results that one can get out of that, and in fact, come up with some additional results, which I want to talk a little bit about. Okay, so let's focus on this optimal, this first order condition under the two regimes, autarky and free trade. As I said, there is the marginal benefit of producing an extra gun, measured in units of land. And there on the other side, we have the opportunity cost of doing so, or the marginal cost. Notice that is just the same as this ratio. That omega is nothing other than the wage rental ratio in country I. And we can do that because unit cost functions, due to the fact that we have constant tensor scale, are linearly homogeneous. And therefore, what really matters is just the wage rental ratio. Okay, so if you think about how these marginal cost and benefits compare across regimes, what can you say? Well, under free trade, certainly marginal cost is independent of guns, because the price is fixed in the world market. The marginal cost of producing an extra gun is a function of guns. Okay. In fact, actually, what we can show is that there's an increasing function of guns. All right, so here is something that may help you think about what is going on here. Let's think a little bit about autarky and how, in particular, this relative price, equilibrium price, might be a function of guns. All right, suppose that countries I's guns increase. What will that do? We show that that is going to lead to an increase in the land-labor ratio that will be left for production of consumption goods. By the Rybczynski theorem, what that will do is it will tend to shift the relative supply function to the right, which will force the equilibrium price under autarky in country I to go down. And if that goes down, then you will observe an increase in the wage rental ratio by the Stocker-Samuelson theorem, which will then cause marginal cost to go up. And that's exactly what I've written over there. And if you observe then how these two regimes differ, at least at this basic level, it's this. The marginal benefit is the same, but the marginal cost differs. Under free trade, it is flat, independent of how many guns are produced by either country. But under autarky, it is an increasing function. Okay? All right. So if we were to go back, actually, and talk a little bit about this idea of power, we can see one thing that perhaps might be obvious, actually, at this point, which is that if we allow for international trade, because both countries will face, I'll go back a little bit, because both countries will face identical prices. Remember, this P that I have there is the pi that is observed by both countries. And by virtue of the fact that all countries have identical technologies, it must be the case that the opportunity cost of producing guns is the same across the two adversaries. Well, as we said a little bit earlier, the marginal benefit of producing guns is the same. So what you should expect, if all countries under free trade face identical prices in the world market, that will lead to an equalization, at least under some circumstances that we spell out in the paper, of factor prices and therefore of opportunity cost. And what you should expect under conditions of factor price equalization, you should expect both countries to produce identical quantities of guns. That's an extreme version of what might happen in this sort of environment, and it has to do with the fact that both prices face identical product prices that pin down factor prices. Okay? But if you think a little bit about what might happen if you have, say, an autarkic regime where initially there is no trade, there we can show that all kinds of asymmetries may arise and we can characterize them. And it may be, in fact, that one country is very large and produces more guns, perhaps, as compared to its rival, but when you go to international trade, this equalization, this leveling of the playing field forces both countries essentially to produce similar quantities of guns. So if you want, that then is something that you can associate with the paradox of power. Okay? We explore that idea a little bit more extensively in both the free trade as well as the autarkic setting. Okay, so what I want to do next then, and see whether I'll be able to manage all of that in 7 minutes? 7 minutes. All right. I want to focus on symmetric adversaries. Okay? And I want to talk about three ideas here. One having to do with trade partners, patterns, welfare comparison, and this idea of resource curves. Okay, not necessarily in that sequence. Now, here we have to make an assumption about the technology of producing guns. Okay? How does it compare to the economy's capital-labor ratio, land-labor ratio? Results do not depend on this assumption, but let's imagine, if you want, that Ki, the economy's endowment of land-labor ratio, as compared to the one we would observe if guns were produced, is higher. Essentially what that implies is that if you focus on the case of symmetric agents, in a symmetric equilibrium, they will produce symmetric quantities of guns. And then the conclusion is going to be that if you were to increase their equal quantities of guns, the land-labor ratio that will be left for the production of consumption and trade of goods, perhaps, is going to increase. Similar to what I had a little bit earlier, but in the context of just country I's guns changing. Okay, so here's a figure that may confuse you, but maybe not. All right. Stelgius thinks that this can be very confusing. And I share his views a little bit, but I'm going to be brave here and see whether I can make any sense out of this. All right. So let's think about not all curves at once, but one at a time. Okay, let's think about this one right here. What is this one? I want you to think about the relative price which I have on this axis. And down here I want you to think of the quantity of guns that country 1 and 2 produce separately. Remember, we are focusing on symmetric agents, and that's what we would observe in equilibrium. Okay? Now imagine that what you do is you raise the relative price of consumption good 2 in the world market. What will that do? An increase in the relative price of good 2 by the Stolper-Samuelson result that we mentioned earlier will tend to reduce the relative wage of labor. And because the relative wage of labor falls, that is going to tend to reduce the marginal cost of producing guns. And if the marginal cost of producing guns falls, what you should observe in equilibrium is an increase in the quantity of guns produced by both agents. So notice, this price that is observed in the world market drives factor prices, which drive opportunity cost, which drive incentives to build guns. This is what would happen if you focused your attention on the relationship between prices and gun production. And it's natural to do that in the context of free trade. All right, so if you want to figure out what will be produced under free trade, just look at the world price, you go to the right and you figure it out. But what about autarky? Now we go to the second graph. The second graph is this one. These were actually tiny dots, but somehow PDF did its own thing. So there is that second graph.
At least there's no laptop.
No other interference.
No scissors.
Okay, so what do we have on this graph? This graph tells you what the equilibrium market clearing price of good 2 is as a function of guns produced by these countries. And what it says is, as both countries produce more guns, that relative price falls. And the reason for that is related to what I said a little bit earlier. Okay, if both countries increase their guns, there will be essentially more, and we make the assumption that production of guns is labor intensive. Yep. More labor will be diverted into the production of guns, less will be left in relative terms for the production of consumption goods. The land-labor ratio in the production of consumption goods will go up, and if it does go up, there will be an increase in the relative supply of labor, which will cause the equilibrium price to go down, and therefore that's exactly why you will have a downward sloping schedule over there. It could have been upward sloping if you had a different assumption of technology. Okay? Okay, where is the equilibrium then, the conflict equilibrium under autarky? The answer is where these two schedules intersect. There it is, on A. Okay? Now, let's think about trade patterns. Okay, what does traditional theory say? Well, if the price that you observe in the world market is less than the price you have under autarky, there will be excess demand, relative demand for good too, and you would expect to import that product, right? Well, you can capture that case right here where there is no production of guns. If you are below that PA, you cannot see it very well, but that's what that is. If the world price is below that level, then in the traditional setting, you will observe the country import the good. And if you are over it, the country will export it. So focusing on the zero production of guns helps you see what happens in the traditional setting. In fact, there's something else that you can do. For any given quantity of guns, you can say something about gains from trade in the traditional setting. For instance, anytime the world price is higher than that PA star price, or lower than that, you know that there will be increased gains from trade. The higher the price of traded goods as compared to the autarky price, the higher the gains from international trade. And that sort of logic extends even if you fix quantities of guns at any particular level, right? And you kind of go either up or below that schedule. In other words, for fixed quantities of guns, welfare is going to be increasing the higher the price, and it's going to be increasing again the lower the price below that autarky schedule. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so what can we say about trade patterns? Okay. Traditional theory, we said what it says. If you are below this level, then you will import the good. But what if you are in a conflict theoretic setting, like the one we considered? Well, it says, if the price is at this level, now the free trade equilibrium is going to be right there, and what you see is a reversal in the pattern of trade. So as compared to traditional trade theory, we can have certainly a very different pattern of trade. There is something that's a little bit more esoteric that can happen if you allow for asymmetric players. And what can happen there, and you cannot really visualize it here, is that if you just look at autarky prices in the presence of conflict, you compare those two world prices and made an inference about trade patterns, if you did that, you would be flatly wrong under some circumstances. And the reason for that has to do with the anticipation of a trade regime, free trade down the road, alters endowments, residual endowments. And by doing that, it essentially changes the structure of comparative advantage. Okay, what about welfare? Well, we said that if you are to move up or down as compared to this line here that divides, that gives you the autarky price, welfare is going to be increasing in standard settings. But what happens in a setting where we have conflict and we move, say, from this conflictual equilibrium to one of free trade? The answer is, well, welfare actually may go down. Why? Well, here it is. If you were to just fix price at any level and move in this direction, you would be increasing quantities of guns of both parties, right? Countries 1 and 2. But if you did that, no country will get more land, right? All you would be doing essentially is diverting resources into this unproductive activity from a social perspective. And that would be decreasing welfare. So essentially, this then suggests that the difference curves, if you want, will be quasi-convex as I have them over here. So that then suggests that if the price moves up, so the country begins, as compared to the autarky price, the country will begin exporting the good, but as it does that, its welfare goes down. And there is a range of prices that will be so. In fact, there's also a range of prices, okay, captured by that distance A all the way to C, that will ensure that the resource curves. Welfare does go down. And that's that. In fact, actually, you can capture it by looking at the decomposition of welfare when you change price. If you change price in the world market, what you will have by the envelope theorem, right? You will have the impact on the terms of trade effect that we talked about before, right? But you will also have a strategic effect coming from the change announced by the country's rival. Okay, so that we know is negative, at least in this kind of setting, where you increase the price, both are producing more guns, right? And what about this guy? Well, initially, If you are considering prices that are in the neighborhood of free trade, that is going to be insignificant. There will be no trade. That MI is going to be 0. So essentially what you're going to have is a strategic effect essentially dominating, causing welfare to go down. Essentially that's what's going on. And there is a conclusion. We have something to say about power. I didn't say much about that. Something about welfare, trade patterns, and resource curves. I am surprised at myself, actually.
Okay, any questions or comments? Osmo?
So yes, it's a very rich paper. So the implications are many, and therefore one feels very much tempted to forgive assumptions that one doesn't like. And so I like the paper, but I still want to press on one issue, that it's not really, in my view, a model of conflict, because you don't have any decision to go to war or not. And we know from recent papers, one of which I wrote with Matt Jackson, that as soon as you introduce that decision, after the arms are already being produced and processed,
Yeah.
and if you and adding some additional cost, that is not just the cost of arming, but it's really the cost of destruction that you have afterwards. Right. We know that this pure strategy, symmetric arming that you have is not an equilibrium anymore. So it's much more complicated. That you need to worry about deterrence levels and all kinds of things that obviously you bypass by basically having this reduced form, like expected sharing of this K0 part. So it's just a caveat that maybe one could acknowledge, because it's not really, in my view, like a model of why there is conflict, because you're lumping the expected payoff from negotiation and the expected payoff from war into the same outcome of the conflict success function, which is that it's not. I mean,
It's a good point, but it does capture an important aspect of conflict, whether it is overt or violent or not, which has to do with resources, and it does that in a way that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but arms races, why not call it arms races? Wouldn't that do? I mean, you can say India getting weapons and Iran getting weapons is just a waste of resources, even if there's no conflict. And then that's the trade-off this is capturing.
Right, but it is not. But the K0, so that what happens to that, it depends on whether you go to war or not. It's not the same. So
that's true. Yeah.
And so that affects the decisions in turn.
That's true. Yeah.
How to arm. So it's much more complicated. Just I like the fact that with this simplification you get a lot. So that's why. But it's still not. I mean, I would prefer, for example, to think of a parallel interpretation, not to change it completely, but a parallel interpretation that does not have this problem. One would be either the research and development one, as suggested before, or an alternative one would be that, if you take any pair of countries, they may have gains from trade to each other, which is like a cooperative activity, and they may have a bunch of competitive activities that would, for example, be competing on other markets on which they would be both sellers with third parties.
You know what happens if you move in that sort of direction, right? You have to make other assumptions. If you move into a three-country world and you allow for trade between two partners, you have to, and you do general equilibrium analysis, right? You have to address, for one thing, the terms of trade effects of that kind of trade. Yeah. You're going to benefit in one way, you're going to lose in another. One of the things that we find very appealing about this kind of setup is that it captures a key element of a number of wars which involve the diversion of real resources into conflict. You have a good point about this model not being something that explains war, whether you go to war or not. Right. We can amend the model to allow for destruction of land or of labor. What will change is, actually not much will change, because what we're interested in is in seeing how international trade affects conflict, right? A conflict is already there, at least the way we define it, right? Is there, no matter whether there is trade or whether there is not trade. At least in this country, simplified 3-7. So you're going to have to give up a lot of flexibility unless you're willing to make strong assumptions about general equipment.
Yeah, can I say add to those things?
Oh, I was
First of
expecting,
all,
yes.
yeah, you will have asymmetries, but these sort of effects, they will be, especially the trade pattern effects, the welfare effects, they will be magnified in any way. It's just that you get more, you have more distraction, so you have less sort of the benefits of trade would be even lower than they would have been otherwise for at least one country. So that's one thing.
In dyadic relationships, perhaps, but not necessarily in such
other ways. Second is that we are not trying to explain war versus peace. We're trying to understand the interdependence of security and trade policies.
Right.
And for that,
Yeah, but
we have 90% of the countries in the world, they have, they are without, and they are in cold war with some sort of neighbor rather than fighting one another, especially since the Second World War. So this is very relevant for the cases where the relevant cost is the cost of arming, the cost of expenditures. Now, if you want to go beyond that, of course, and add it, it just will make a lot of the effects that we're discussing even stronger in some
It
way.
is very relevant, but it is the relationship between trade openness and arming in a given type of conflictual environment. It is not a relationship between trade openness and war onset. Is that clear?
Yeah.
We have to be very clear about it.
Yeah, that's for me.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I'll just put my IR hat. One thing that kind of, I was bored, I mean, it's already way complicated, obviously, but what's contestable is independent on how many guns I own. And that really bothered me, because in a way, once I build a navy, no beach is out of reach. I can expand the region over which I can contest things. Now, it's not just my neighbor's well that I can contest, and go and grab that guy's and that guy's. So your model, if I understand correctly, maybe is really understating the utility of having guns because of this. You can be grabbing a lot more. And I'm actually worried about this equalization too. Because, and again, I hate to say this, but I may have one type of conflict with you, and if it's resolved peacefully, my navy now can turn and handle the conflict with him. And I just don't know how you would handle something in a framework like this.
Well, that's an issue that concerns all models of conflict.
Yes.
So, all right, so
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. I mean,
so you're model two.
All Fearon Powell models with two countries. What happened with three?
Yeah. So that's get to do.
We all signed in the defense.
But wait a second. In terms of what the insights will be here, if you were to allow for conflict to extend, offer this K0 that we had, to include Ki, how would the basic insights on trade patterns and welfare change?
You know, lots of pictures.
Well, you haven't seen many pictures. So, you know, if you think about it, if you can get those
the
results.
only thing that is secure is the thing that you can defend. So you have to be thinking in terms of deterrence.
You can do that. I mean, you can extend the, well.
This is
Then-
deterrence essentially, because that's what it
Yeah.
is. This is a model of a Cold War.
You could allow for anything to be contested here, even your life. I mean, there's nothing in the model that prevents you from doing that. I thought you meant something different though, that maybe if you contest a little bit of this land, maybe you can then increase your demands, and perhaps if you're successful, you can get more. But other than, if you're not thinking of something like that, then the analysis extends naturally. But you also had another point, which I did not register.
Why don't we take a 10-minute break, rearm with caffeine for those who need it, and we'll meet here just a few minutes after 3, and we'll have one more presentation.
Are we fighting it?